just looking over on my other screen to see if ChatGPT had delivered my personalized newsletter that I'd asked for at 3 p.m. yesterday. I'm actually not seeing it. I know it's in beta. I think it was supposed to pop up at some point on my screen, but I'm not seeing it. Hi, I'm Matt Marshall, founder and editor-in-chief of VentureBeat. I'm here with Sam Witteveen, who's in Singapore, an ML expert and co-founder of Dragon AI, developing a lot of generative AI applications. Sam, how are you?
Nice to talk to you again.
So Sam, a lot of news this week. One of the items that caught our attention was AutoGen version 0.4, which is this update of Microsoft's AutoGen agent framework. It seemed pretty comprehensive. This is one of the leading agentic frameworks, and now that AI agents have become all the rage, there's a lot of focus on these frameworks like LangChain with LangGraph, and also Crew AI. AutoGen seems to be the third big one, with Microsoft integrating some of these capabilities into Azure. It seems to be potentially one of the leaders for enterprise, which is one of the reasons I wanted to focus on it a little bit. They make the first big statement in bold. AutoGen addresses these issues with its asynchronous, event-driven architecture. This seems to reference to the fact that these sub-agents respond to a reasoner agent in real live through an event-driven architecture. Can you talk about why this is important?
Okay, this is definitely important. Agent frameworks, or at least the top level ones, are certainly going asynchronous. What does this actually mean? I'll give you an example. If you've got a task where an agent's going to be doing something with multiple tools, right? It maybe one needs to call this API, do this other thing, and get those things to put together an answer or a report for you. You don't want it doing the first tool, waiting for that to finish, then going to the next one, waiting for that to finish, then going like that, right? The whole idea of asynchronous is that it can call these things, but it doesn't have to wait for those to come back. It can start working on the next part. And then as those come back in, it can use them. This idea of asynchronous messaging is key, especially when we're talking about multi-agents. You really want something where you're not just waiting for one agent to do something for the next agent to start. If they're reliant on the output of the first agent, okay, maybe you want it to wait. But a lot of the time, you're going to have multiple agents go off, get various pieces of data, do various tasks, and then come back together. This is definitely a step forward. Another sort of thing that was key in this is how this relates to the Magenta 1 app that Microsoft previewed late last year, which was like a key thing. And you can see in their diagrams here, they're saying we made Magenta 1, which was a kind of impressive agent sort of app. And we've given you that as a free code base to learn from to build your own apps. So I think that's really key here. There's a number of other things in this release. The whole idea of extensions, of allowing people to build their own tools, their own extensions for doing this. It is going to be interesting to see how much does Microsoft now start to really push this with their developer ecosystem.
Right. And the way you explain these asynchronous event-driven architecture, right, where these agents can work, asynchronously with this reasoner agent, so it's not this rigid, single thread system. It sounds so obvious, right? And is that why some people left some developers decided to leave their focus on AutoGen and maybe start working more with LangChain and Crew AI? Do those solutions have this event-driven architecture? Could you talk a little bit about,
Yes.
it just feels so obvious that this would be an event-driven architecture, but maybe it's more difficult than it seems to actually implement.
So LangChain and LangGraph has supported this from the early days there. Same with Llama Index and some of the other ones. Crew AI is a latecomer in some ways. Crew AI is actually very interesting for a number of reasons. The sort of top tier of these agent frameworks, people are starting to do this. It is funny that Hugging Face released an agent framework just recently. And one of the comments I got was like, yeah, but come on, you're releasing something that's not fully asynchronous in this day and age, right? So
Right.
people noticing these things.
Right. So
Um,
all those things that Microsoft launched at the recent event, we were talking about all these pre-built agents, various areas, right, with customer support and so on. So if that was all based on AutoGen, right, which I'm assuming it was, then it didn't
maybe,
have this
maybe
central
not.
architecture. Are you saying that some of these pre-built agents just weren't that sophisticated, and this is going to allow Microsoft developers and customers to have more performant agents? Is it that simple?
So I don't think we should jump to the conclusion that everything at Microsoft is being built on this.
Okay.
Most big companies at the moment have multiple bets going on and multiple teams trying out different ideas for this. So we may find that the Copilot studio is actually doing something totally different, right? They've got their own way of doing it. I do think it is interesting that Microsoft has doubled down on this now and saying, yeah, look, we've got Copilot Studio, which is more the sort of consumer thing and business front end for this. But we want to support we want to support developers who want to build agents. So this is our take on this. It is going to be really interesting to see, can you in the future, will we be able to make a AutoGen and then load it in Copilot Studio? Now that's going to be pretty cool, right? Because you could imagine a lot of companies maybe want the sort of flexibility that this low level stuff gives you of where they can develop their own tools, their own extensions, but they would like all their teams to be able to use it in the sort of Microsoft front end software. So I think that's going to be one of the next steps. It is interesting here that they talk about things like the drag and drop team builder. So they are thinking about how do we make things where we can have both the low level stuff, but also give people a higher level to experiment with as well. I think that kind of brings us to where the stuff around crew AI came about because all these tools were so complicated. One of the things that people loved about it was that it was very simple to put things together. Now, the challenge was while it was simple to put together, often they wouldn't necessarily work very well. They've upped their game a lot and now put a lot more low level stuff in, but I feel that they've lost that ability to have the sort of simpleness for people who know a little bit of code to be able to put something together. Now you need to know these other fancy things about flows if you want to do stuff. It will be interesting to see how does this play out. Does Microsoft go, okay, we're going to have this as the low level, but we're still going to give you a simple way to make these things as well with this framework. I actually have a friend who works on this team, and some of those key people are working on UI versions of this. Microsoft did release a thing called AutoGen Studio, which was a sort of visual front end for some of this. If they're still working on that and improving, that's a good sign for many people to see.
So for our listeners, Sam, my take is that it depends on the listener's use case, right? So if the listeners here trying to build an app, trying to bet on a framework, LangChain, Crew AI, AutoGen are all relatively comparable. There's no clear leader, slam dunk front runner here. They've just got to try these things out and see what works for them.
I think a lot of it comes back to what the experience of the developers coming to this project is, whether they've done any sort of things like this before, whether they've used LLMs before. More often than not, we are prototyping in some of these frameworks, trying them out. But then for production, we go back to much more low level stuff where we can control the code ourselves. So we maybe use something smaller like Pydantic AI, where it's a much lighter wrapper. We use basic sort of Python for doing some of these stuff. And that sort of means that you don't have to worry too much about where LangChain, LangGraph, or Crew AI is going. Those frameworks are still very good for looking at ideas, prototyping, trying things out, getting a sense of where things are. I get the feeling that Microsoft is perhaps making a bet now of, okay, how do we make all of this production level ready? And that's what the asynchronous stuff really is in there, is that they are adding a lot of these things. It's interesting, we can see on that diagram, they're structuring it here. You've got your Magentic one, which is their really sort of cool the extensions, which are the tools, but then you've got an agent chat level, and then you've got the core level. They're structuring it more like a typical machine learning framework in some ways, of where you've got higher level abstractions, but you've got this low level stuff that's going on. And if they decide to double down on that and have some unique ways of supporting that with Azure, this this really could become a thing for them. It really is something that you could imagine a lot of Microsoft developers adopting. This is the first version, I think, that we've seen out of Microsoft since some of the original creators left Microsoft. So there was a bit of hoo-ha about the original people leaving and trying to redo it as a startup or something like that.
Chi Wang was the founder of AutoGen, but he was at Microsoft Research, presumably behind a lot of what Microsoft's been doing. And then in September, he went to Google to work for DeepMind, and apparently was trying to see if he could disassociate AutoGen from Microsoft. Microsoft said no. And so Microsoft kept AutoGen, and now Chi Wang and his group has basically forked this to AG2. I don't know if you saw, but it recently showed off this Captain Agent example to showcase some of this stuff.
I really think they could have done better with their branding with AG2. Would have been better just to pick a whole new name. They've created a lot of confusion amongst people who were very pro AutoGen, trying to work out, do I go the Microsoft route or do I go this original guy's route?
Well, yeah, and it feels like Microsoft was making these veiled comments about how they got all this feedback on AutoGen about how unscalable it was, right? It needed more extensibility, right? And robustness, right? There's these paragraphs at the top of this post, right? I mean, we go back to it here, right? Which is basically kind of saying, that there was some big limitations. It's almost just like a slap on the original founder. You talk about this big hoopla where it wasn't event-driven architecture. Like, what were they doing? Interesting questions about where that group goes, right, with AG2 group. Speaking of Google, it sounds like what you're saying is that this is good stuff for prototyping, these frameworks, right? The ownership by one of these big cloud platforms isn't necessary because the developer using this is going to prototype in these frameworks, but then they're going to go back and use these other internal tools. However, it feels like what you're also saying, which seems to make sense, is that if Microsoft's going to really increase the feature set here, then presumably the bet is that if you're prototyping, you'd prefer to stay there, right? If you get application ready agents and then start using Azure as well, since it's attached to the cloud, right? So presumably there is some competition between the big cloud providers to get this right.
For sure. One thing we should point out is that, as far as I know, while the original people have gone to Google, Google's not doing anything with AG2. Like, it's not necessarily that they're trying to pick this up. It seems to be like his side project. There are people using LangChain LangGraph for production, using Llama Index, using AutoGen for production. I do think 2025 could be the year where things are sorted out now, and developers are able to just pick one of these things and see it through from prototyping to production. A lot of teams are starting to pick one of these things and adopt it. You're seeing True AI make big moves where they're making a front end for enterprise where people can go in, drag and drop and fill out forms and stuff. I think we're going to see two directions: the easy direction for the low code, no code people, and the low level sort of thing on another side.
So Sam, this framework shows the core at the bottom, right? Which feels like Microsoft seems to be saying is that that's been rebuilt, right? That the agent chat on top of that core is what mostly resembles what version 0.2 was, since it makes it for an easy API convert. But can you talk a little bit about what agent chat is? I think for a lot of folks who may not be familiar with AutoGen, agent chat sounds like it's humans chatting with agents, but can you talk a little bit about what agent chats is?
Okay, so from what I understand, and I'm not a big user of AutoGen, but this is like their communication, their API to be able to have agents communicate with each other, pass messages back and forth, update each other about the state of things. If we look at maybe the Magentic one, that's got some really nice examples of this. We can see that there's an orchestrator going on, but it's actually going to these little sort of multi-agents, or you can even think of them as tools. I think they refer to them as multiple agents, where one of them is a file surfer that can get files from your drive. One of them's a web surfer where not only can it go and scrape something from a web page, but it can go and fill out a form for you and return the results. And they've even got agents that specialize in coding, where the agent will basically realize that, oh, it's probably best that it writes some code to work out how to do something mathematical or something. And then even things like computer terminals. So one of the things that AutoGen has really been working hard at is building these sort of suite of sort of self-contained agents that can do these specific tasks and communicate with each other.
Right. And this is the prime example of this autonomous flow adaptation model, the epitome of allowing the agent to run by itself. And see what you're saying is this is kind of the ideal state, right, Sam, for enterprise users. This is where we want to go. We're not there in 25. So much control that an enterprise typically needs to have around all these things. They want to get there, but right now it's much more control. You've got to control it with humans. So if you comment on the extent to which we can actually move to something like this right now.
So it is true, Matt, that where things are now is that a lot of companies are worried about these agents doing things they shouldn't be doing. You don't really want a computer terminal agent that could wipe all your hard drives. So people are trying to write in lots of safety measures. This is a huge area with agents. One of the things the Magentic one, which is using AutoGen, has implemented is this whole interesting way of having a self-planning system where it has this like task ledger that it plans out what it needs to do. And then for each task, it has this progress ledger where it tracks what it's doing. It's really cool in that it can constantly go back and forth between these two to check, is it on track to actually do what it's supposed to do? And at any point, if it notices like, no, this task is not complete, okay, are we making some progress? No. Okay, we need to go back. Or yes, okay, let's go to the sort of next part of this. But this constant, really interesting multiple ledger idea was unique to Magentic 1 when it came out. So we were talking before about flow engineering and stuff like that. It allows it to engineer the flow in a way that should be safer. And this is one of the things that they're claiming, right? That this is much more effective because of this multi-ledger thing, because it's able to check and stuff, it's able to get much better results. It is interesting that this is the first example app or thing they've introduced like this. Will they show a bunch more? Will we see some of these ambient apps that we saw, LangChain and rolling out also coming to AutoGen? It's quite possible that we'll see some things. They did say that the coder, the computer terminal, the web surfer, file surfer were just the first examples of some of these, and that you should expect more to come going forward.
Yeah, Andrew Ng recently talked about there being 4 design patterns for agents, right? He's reflection, tool use, right, which is the API calls you've referred to, the planning, which is deciding on what steps to take, which it looks like there's this progress ledger and a task ledger there, multi-agent collaboration. The reflection design pattern, where is that reflected here?
Okay, so the whole idea with reflection is basically getting the model to reflect on itself. Have I done this properly? We can see that here where we see where it's asking itself, is the task complete? Is progress being made? It's seeing, okay, I've done it, but maybe I haven't done a great job. So there wasn't much progress. I need to go back and maybe rewrite that progress ledger or rewrite the task ledger of how I'm going to break it down. This idea with Magentic 1 that kind of made it interesting was this sort of dual ledger system of having one that sort of has a high level plan and one that has a much more low level plan going on there.
Right.
I think that the planning is definitely one of the key things that wasn't working well last year and the year before, with the LLMs just not being good enough. They are getting much better now at doing some of these things. I think people have worked out how to use these things for planning. If you look at it in a traditional, very academic definition of planning, they're not doing planning in that way, but they are doing planning in the way that we would make a to-do list and be able to follow that through. I think the big thing I would add to sort of Andrew Ng's patterns there is just this whole LLM as a judge has come out as a thing of this whole idea of evaluation, of being able to have models and prompts that really are able to look at maybe a few examples that get made and go, that one's the best one. And that's the best plan to go with, and those sorts of things. We're seeing these things where the flow engineering last year was very tightly controlled with things like LangGraph. this sort of Magentic one is giving more agency to the agents. It's giving them more ability to decide their own flow and pattern.
But basically what you're saying is this is state of the art. And is there anything that it doesn't have? I think you referred to a couple of things that maybe LangChain or Crew AI have, right? You referred to ambience and so on. Is there anything specifically that this is missing?
So I wouldn't say this is necessarily missing. This is built to be a certain kind of agent, where the task is given in. What we're not seeing here is all the different triggers that could trigger this, like we talked about. So there are a bunch of triggers that could get them started, and they don't need to be a chat interface. And
Right.
I think this is where suddenly this year people are going to go, we could use an agent to do this. Once a day, we would love to have an agent go through and check a whole bunch of different things. At the end of the day, you may see things where people finish up their work and then the agents go through and look at it and go, okay, hey, the marketing has come up with some really good ideas. I should also forward those to the CEO, or these other people have done this really interesting work. We should inform the sales department, or this kind of thing. It's going to be interesting to see, how do companies adapt to that kind of thing? Do they take it and run with, or be conservative with it? And I think we're going to see a mixture of it. Already we're seeing certain companies be very bullish on this and certain companies being like, yeah, no, not for us yet. Like you mentioned, you and your team are out there talking to companies all the time, right? What are you hearing people talk about? Because I wonder, have people actually been using agents or even interested in agents yet?
We are having extensive conversations with real companies. And sometimes that's around companies that we're inviting to our VB Transform event, where you get Fortune 500 enterprise companies and smaller companies as well, talking about how they're actually building these things. It's very interesting. I just got off a call with the folks at AB InBev, right? It's a major consumer company, Anheuser-Busch, the parent company. They're talking about how a lot of companies just need to get their data layers right. A lot of companies are nowhere close to actually using some of this agentic stuff. And you have these conversations. Been talking with the Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, a lot of the healthcare companies. In conversation after conversation, you get the sense that the real enterprise, they're excited about what's coming with agents, but they're really just getting their data infrastructure in order. And I think that's what you're going to see as another continued trend. It may be a little boring, right? Maybe something we've heard in the past. Hey, it's data, 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 get your data ready. But to your point about agents being ready this year, I remember you had a great blog post about the 5 things that are hindering agents. The fact that you need a human to be controlling a lot of the flow, controlled flow engineering. You can't let these agents just run autonomously and adapting on their own, because they don't have this framework of values that an enterprise company has. All the things around alignment and safety protocols, security protocols, those things are dynamic, right? There's a new situation. How does that agentic framework respond to dynamism? And it's very tough to actually let these agents run. So there's the data question, there's the value question. And I think, as you're saying, all these things are being sorted out. So there's going to be some really interesting developments this year in 2025.
That's a really good point, is that the majority of companies are not ready for this. They're just starting to incorporate things like Copilot Studio. And it does seem that maybe that's not going to be a big deal. Maybe they're going to come just as the big companies are starting to get on board with the idea of these sorts of things. We had a really interesting release this week from people at OpenAI, right? With this GPT task. Now, this is not necessarily a hardcore agent thing, but it's certainly going down that road, right? Did you see that, Matt? The whole sort of thing about where you can set up a task with OpenAI?
Yes, I did see it. In fact, I was just looking over on my other screen to see if ChatGPT had delivered my personalized newsletter that I'd asked for at 3 p.m. yesterday. I'm actually not seeing it. I know it's in beta. I think it was supposed to pop up at some point on my screen, but I'm not seeing it. Have you tried it out, Sam?
I've had a quick play with it. I've heard from other people exactly what you're saying, that they're not getting the task done, and then it hallucinates and says, oh, it's because you gave me too many tasks and they gave it one task. Or some quite funny stories out there of things like, it is an interesting thing. And it goes with one of the things that LangChain talked about this week that VentureBeat had a story on, around ambient agents, that we're going to move away from chat interfaces. Chat interfaces were great for the first year or two, but people have really seen the problems with the chat interface. And really, if we're going to have some AGI or some super AI or something like that, we want it where we don't have to go and tell it what to do all the time. It just does it. And I think this is where LangChain this week has launched an email agent system. I think Harrison was saying that it reads his email, drafts responses, and uses that information. This is a really interesting step. Matt, what would you want? What would you do with an ambient agent? This is a question I think everyone's starting to ask themselves. Is tasks maybe a little bit too simple, but what do we actually want these things to do?
I think that's the key question. I think there's plenty that we would do. For example, his example walked us through how you have this ambient system that can track emails that are coming in, and then maybe a judge element, right? Deciding when to actually generate a response, how to generate a response. And I think that's pretty powerful. One of the things that I've been relying on for a long time is Google's Gmail and the priority filter there. It's really prioritizing my emails. So it's gotten to the point where I don't have a lot of difficulty, like a lot of people, staying on top of my email. But when it comes to actually drafting responses and doing things autonomously in the background, and then serving up some recommendations on things that I should check to see if I should indeed send responses, because this one's been pretty late. It's been there 20 days. It's something that I have prioritized. I think that's pretty strong. The other example is the one around social posting. If you've got a site like ours and we're publishing articles, can you actually automate some of that social posting flow instead of having to do it ourselves? I think that's potentially powerful. I didn't look too deeply at that example, but we can. So, I do think that those are good examples. I like that, the task feature on OpenAI is, I think, particularly powerful because of the memory in personalization it has now. They've talked about how they don't have this continuous memory across all chats, but in discrete areas, if you ask it to store a memory about who you are, what your job function is, what some of the challenges are you may have in this or that part of your life, whether it's professional or personal, it's tracking all that. So if you have an interface where you can set a task to remind you to do this or that, I think that's pretty powerful. And it's going to be so much simpler than using a calendar alert from one of your calendar apps or workflow apps like Asana or some other tool. I think this potentially could be a big disruptor if it starts working, right? I will be a user, and I'm using OpenAI pretty regularly with ChatGPT and exploring others, but I find that AI is doing a good job introducing these sorts of things because of its memory. Thanks everyone for watching. Like and subscribe for more insights into the latest in AI and technology. For deeper analysis and updates, visit VentureBeat.com and sign up for our newsletters. Stay informed and ahead of the curve.